Hello everyone! The movie I was hoping to review this week didn't arrive at the library on time, so once again I had to come up with a plan B, and it occurred to me that some of you may be interested in hearing about what books I've been reading lately. So let's do a little reading update. I was starting to wonder if that Snowbound project I did this winter and spring had broken me, because I picked up one book after another that I just couldn't get into. A couple of them were duds, but a couple of them, they were fine. The problem was me. And as someone who has always loved reading, that was pretty upsetting. But thank goodness I broke out of that slump a couple weeks ago. I read Lincoln's Dreams by Connie Willis. I'm going to call it a fantasy novel in which a historical fiction writer's assistant encounters a young woman who is having disturbing dreams about the Civil War. That's the American Civil War, I should clarify. It was either last year or the year before that I read my first Connie Willis novel, which was Doomsday Book, and I absolutely loved it. There's a link to my review in the description, but if I can add a little update, I have thought about that book many times since. There were scenes that burned themselves into my memory. I've gone over whole sections of it again in my head, and every time I reflect on it, I think, man, that was a good book, and I'd really like to read it again, except I have a feeling that if I read it a second time too soon, I would feel like, okay, that wasn't nearly as good the second time around. I probably need to wait at least 5 years. I read To Say Nothing of the Dog a while later, and it didn't have nearly the same effect on me that Doomsday Book did. It was okay, but I didn't love it the way a lot of people do, and that's fine. And then I chose Lincoln's Dreams, which is not one that anybody recommended. It's not one of her more famous books, but I happen to own it. Having read it, I get why it's not considered one of her best. For starters, the title, Lincoln's Dreams, is kind of a misnomer. The book has more to do with Robert E. Lee than Abraham Lincoln, and it's kind of a weird premise. It has a lot to do with the interpretation of dreams, and that is just not something that I'm into at all. I did like the book. The first half was engaging and entertaining, with some dribbles of humor mixed in with a certain spookiness and a sense of impending tragedy. But despite the fact there wasn't actually much to the story, it's only 212 pages long, it started to drag. As with other Willis novels, there's a lot of phone tag and voicemail messages and missed connections, and then it seemed as if Willis couldn't figure out a resolution. The last part is kind of a mess, and the very last chapter was almost incoherent to me. Willis does this thing where she keeps trying to draw subtle parallels with her descriptions. She'll say that so-and-so rubbed her wrist over here, and then 2 pages later, this other person rubs his wrist. She'll mention lockjaw on one page, and then she'll mention lockjaw over here, and it's... in a way, it's clever. She's playing with the reader's ability to pick up on little details and lock them away. But she overdoes it, and eventually the connections on top of connections on top of connections, which may or may not be significant, become tedious, and even the significant connections are almost rendered meaningless. Not to mention, if anyone, even an established New York Times best-selling author, tried to get this book published today, they'd immediately be targeted for cancellation. The crime, according to the rage-filled comments on Goodreads, is that Willis speaks warmly of General Robert E. Lee and praises the sense of duty and honor among Confederate soldiers. Next, I read House of Stairs by William Sleator. Sleator? Sleator? It's a twisted, disturbing, kind of dystopian feeling novel in which 5 orphaned 16-year-olds are plucked out of their foundling homes and dumped in a vast structure made entirely of stairs. Stairs everywhere, leading nowhere. There are no windows, no doors. The only source of water is a toilet. If you want to go to the bathroom, you have to use this toilet that's just stuck out there in the middle of all these stairs and anybody can watch you. And food only comes as a reward for a specific kind of behavior. It's a crazy scenario, but I really enjoyed this one. Although it gets quite dark, much darker than I anticipated. The characters were well developed, their personality clashes were interesting, and the scenario is kind of terrifying. It reminded me of a cross between the Jean-Paul Sartre play No Exit and William Golding's Lord of the Flies. It had a couple dated elements, but overall I thought it was well executed. An intriguing psychological thriller written primarily for older kids. There is some mature language and content, so I would say it's not really for pre-teens. I liked it so much that I looked up the author to see if there was something else I might be interested in reading. Maybe one of you has a suggestion. I did look at the blurbs for a few of his books, and there were a couple that I felt like, okay, that one's not for me. But there were others that sounded interesting, so I would welcome any recommendations that anybody has. Next up, we have a reread of Time Enough for Drums by Anne Rinaldi, about a teenage girl coming of age in New Jersey during the American Revolution. I'd been thinking about rereading this for a while, and finding myself in a revolutionary, common-sense, patriotic mood, and also in the mood for a little romance for a change, I decided the 4th of July would be the perfect time to crack this open again. And it was. It has a chapter with the public reading of the Declaration of Independence, so it was just the right thing for last week. I think it's a pretty good book, although I realize now that it could have been even better than it was. It's unfortunate that the girl spends so much of the book being kind of a brat, although she does grow a lot over the course of the novel as she comes to experience the heartache, deprivation, and danger of war. The first half is what I was all about the first time I read this many years ago. I mentioned this in a video I did in 2020, I think it was, when I was going through my old quotation book. I had 2 quotes from this, and one of them was from a certain scene that really made my teenage heart flutter. My not teenage heart wasn't quite so stirred this time. For one thing, the element of surprise was no longer there. I knew it was coming, because not only did I read this chapter once, I read it over and over and over again. But as an adult, my perspective has changed, and I can't get away from the fact that this character is really young. She's not even 16 when the book starts. Her love interest is 9 years older, and he's her tutor. So, historical context and cultural context and the individuals involved does matter, and it does make a difference, but the romantic stuff is actually more of a subplot, and it takes a back seat in the second half of the novel, which is why the second half of the book kind of bored me when I was a teenager reading this. What I appreciate now is that the second half is where it actually gets into the grim, heavy-hitting material, the more educational stuff that imagines what life may have been like for a young woman living through the revolution. I just wish that Rinaldi had made some changes, had at least made her protagonist a couple years older, and maybe not had the tutor, in addition to teaching her math and penmanship, also training her to be an ideal wife, hopefully for himself. It was squicky in 86 and it's squicky now. Especially when he says the line, "I have loved you for so long." I feel like, excuse me? What do you mean, so long? Are we talking a matter of months? Or a matter of years? Because if that's what you mean, when did this begin? When she was 14? 13? And you were, what, 22? That's not okay. It's just not okay. Earlier this week, I picked up There's nothing to see here, I might as well not hold it. I picked up The Shrinking Man by Richard Matheson, the sci-fi, or is it fantasy, novel that the 1957 film The Incredible Shrinking Man is based on, about an ordinary guy who passes through a strange mist and later discovers he's shrinking a little bit each day. I really liked some of this. I liked how it's told out of sequence, going back and forth between tiny Scott Carey's harrowing misadventures trapped in his basement, having to fight this enormous Black Widow spider, and his recollections of the previous year. The movie, directed by Jack Arnold, stands out among 50s sci-fi horror films, not just for its smooth effects, but for its depth and its philosophical conclusion. That depth comes straight from Matheson's novel. There is a prevailing melancholy and loneliness, and it's heavy with the protagonist's rage and despair over his incomprehensible and helpless situation. The book has some mature content that the censors would never have allowed in the film. Some of it is implied in the movie, though, his feeling of inadequacy with his wife. It's just not explicit. And it's not really explicit here, either. The humiliation he endures is more intense in the book, I would say, and his family's financial predicament is more clear. Writing-wise, I liked this better than the other Richard Matheson book I read a few years ago, I Am Legend. And I thought the first half was awesome. It was gripping, tense, mysterious, psychological, sad. I was really into it. And then my enthusiasm nosedived. I can't remember the last time I was reading a book and my opinion changed so drastically, so fast, and there was no coming back from it. What happened? The main character became a peeping Tom obsessed with the teenage babysitter, and the writing got very sexual all of a sudden. I wasn't just uncomfortable with it, I was disgusted, and it ruined the rest of the book for me. I will allow that it's not arguing that his behavior in this chapter is acceptable, but it's not exactly a strong condemnation either. And Matheson definitely could have continued discussing the character's frustrations with intimacy, as he had been, without going in this direction, and without suddenly getting so descriptive and pervy. That's what it was. It felt pervy. It was gross. The images were then placed in the reader's mind, and that basically makes the reader feel like an accessory to the crime. And it is a crime. I'm not going to take a wishy-washy, to each their own stance on this. There's nothing about the context here that makes it okay. And in light of so much of the discussion these days regarding the sexualization of children and predatory behavior and all of that, I was probably more disgusted than I would have been a few years ago. I almost threw the book at the wall. That's how angry and dismayed and disappointed I was. But I did finish it, and it is a good book. That's part of what makes it so maddening, is that it's a good book. It's even a great book, except for Chapter 11. I feel like you could skip Chapter 11, and you wouldn't miss anything, because it sticks out like a sore thumb. It doesn't even fit in with the way the rest of the book is written. And like I said, there is mature content elsewhere in the book. But it's not explicit. And that's why the stuff in this chapter feels so it's so... ugh. And so I think it's a shame that Matheson, for whatever reason, had to go there and had to scuttle an otherwise fine work of thought-provoking literature. Anyway, let's move on, but I'm gonna pause a second because the neighbors are getting their landscaping done right now, and I have 5 leaf blowers humming outside my window, and it's driving me crazy. While I was reading The Shrinking Man, I was also reading The Rest of the Robots by Isaac Asimov. Some of you may remember I reviewed Asimov's I, Robot last summer, and a couple weeks ago I was on the verge of ordering The Caves of Steel from the library, which I thought was next in the series, but then I found out that there's this little collection of 8 stories, which is essentially a companion to I, Robot, and I decided to check it out first. Good news! It was very enjoyable, and I had a great time with it, and there was nothing objectionable. For the most part, these short stories are as accessible as the ones in I, Robot, meaning you don't have to be a super scientific thinker, you don't need to understand all the ins and outs of the positronic brain to follow along. Each story is prefaced with some comments from the author, and these were often tongue-in-cheek. In general, this collection feels lighter than I, Robot, and I enjoyed that. I enjoyed the wittiness. I also like that I, Robot and this can be viewed differently depending on the reader's own opinion of not just robots, but artificial intelligence and its potential impact on society. Someone who thinks it's a great idea will probably be pleased with Asimov's vision. Someone who thinks it's a terrible idea will hone in on all the alarming near disasters and the loopholes in programming that cause all kinds of problems and say, "See? This is why we can't let robots take over." For the record, and I believe I talked about this in my review of I, Robot, it's not necessarily the robots themselves or the AI that I am wary of. It's the people who make and control the AI who will inevitably try to harness that power to achieve their own ends. They're the ones that I don't trust. Anyway, like I said, this book feels lighter. My favorite story, in fact, was the very first one, Robot AL-76 Goes Astray, because it was so funny. It was humorous, the scenario was humorous, and then the way that it was written was so... it was charming, and it was cheeky, and I just loved it. The second one, Victory Unintentional, took a little time for me to get into it, but that was amusing as well. And I also really enjoyed Satisfaction Guaranteed, which was more bittersweet and psychological. That was not a funny one. So if you're a fan of I, Robot, I recommend checking this out too. They go hand in hand. And those are the books that I've read in the past few weeks. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know what you think of anything that I talked about in the comments below, and I will see you next week. Hopefully, my movie will have arrived. Thanks for watching.